Hello, this holy Saturday. Today is March 30th. Today is day 176 since October 7th. And if you weren't able to join us today, we had an Easter vigil in solidarity with our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters. You can view that on Churches for Middle East Peace's YouTube page. That was in solidarity with a number of partners. I'd invite you to visit that. One of our invitations is that the bishop's letter of global leaders that last week had 140 signatures. It now has, I think, 160 of global leaders calling not only for a ceasefire, but also the withholding of weapons. That letter is now open for anyone to sign. So you can find a link for individuals to be able to sign that on our social media as well. And so I would invite you to join us. Our goal is to use that letter as a mobilization tool around the world for people to talk to their heads of state and their elected officials, calling for an end to the bombing of Gaza, calling for a comprehensive ceasefire, a return of the hostages that are being held captive in Gaza, a return or a release of those who are held in Israeli prisons without due process, and that the core causes of the ongoing oppression and occupation of Palestinians would be addressed. What's been happening in the last few days, several updates in that regard. Gaza ceasefire pilgrimages have continued. Those will be continuing even after the Western calendar's Lent has finished. Our Orthodox brothers and sisters are continuing. They are just in the middle of Lent right now, but the pilgrimages will continue. And the goal is that those will shift focus a bit. So we will increasingly focus on calling on our elected officials as that next phase. Yesterday, I participated in one in Philadelphia. That was at Lockheed Martin. We were calling for an end to the manufacturing of weapons. They're one of the largest manufacturers in the world, many of which are being used in the bombing of Gaza. 13,000 children have been killed in Gaza already since October. And I joined with several, I think it was a couple of hundred people who gathered for the prayer vigil, who gathered for the last day of that pilgrimage. But more than 20 of us engaged in civil disobedience and were arrested as a part of our activism, calling for an end to those weapons being used against civilians in Gaza. Upon release, I learned from the Washington Post that despite a deepening gap in terms of the criticism of the U.S.'s engagement in the Gaza war, the Biden administration quietly approved the transfer of fighter jets and bombs worth billions of dollars to Israel over the past few days. So there's a big question about how much liberty President Biden is taking going around Congress. He already had passed or sold so many weapons to Israel because it was underneath a certain amount threshold. But this was worth billions of dollars. So that just was announced yesterday. Progressive Democrats, including Senator Merkley and Senator Sanders, criticized the Biden administration over the report, saying that the U.S. cannot beg Netanyahu to stop bombing civilians one day and the next day send him thousands more 2,000-pound bombs that can level entire city blocks. So that is the news from Capitol Hill. In Gaza, Israel is promoting a multinational force, a group that would be responsible for the secure delivery of aid, humanitarian aid in Gaza. The force would rely on representatives from friendly Arab nations, Egypt and Jordan, for example, for a limited time. Their role would be, quote, to defend the port that the U.S. government is building. Just for the record, that port is still not going to be done for at least a month, but the idea is that they would help with the delivery of aid. A shipment of 400 tons of food left Larnaca in Cyprus. That's a second dispatch of aid from Cyprus in cooperation with Israel. That was just announced. The Israeli army said in a joint statement with the Shin Bet security service that the IDF troops killed 3 senior Hamas members in Gaza al-Shifa's hospital complex. And then speaking at a press conference with his Egyptian and French counterparts in Cairo, Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi said this weekend that famine in Gaza could be dealt with in a short period of time if Israel opened the land crossings for aid to enter. The death toll is now 32,705 Palestinians killed and more than 75,000 wounded. 3 UN observers and a translator in South Lebanon were wounded this weekend when a shell exploded near them. The Israeli Defense Forces denied allegations that they were involved. 2 security sources had earlier said that the observers were wounded in an Israeli airstrike. The Israeli army said on Friday that its fighter jets attacked military infrastructure and rocket sites near certain areas in South Lebanon. And also on Saturday, the IDF had reported it struck Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon as well. In the West Bank, the Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that a 13-year-old was shot and killed overnight into Saturday by Israeli Defense Forces. The IDF said the incident is being investigated and that Israeli forces were shot at and responded with fire. The U.S. State Department announced that they welcome the nomination of the new PA, the Palestinian Authority Cabinet, and that they will be engaging with this new government to deliver incredible reforms. We actually have a relationship with some of those new cabinet members, and we'll be meeting with them some when we're back in Palestine in May. That's Churches for Middle East Peace I'm speaking about. Israeli police plan to deploy additional units this weekend because of protests in Tel Aviv. The Tel Aviv district commander warned protest leaders that they would act, quote, in accordance with authority, end quote, in light of escalating demonstrations. Protest leaders said they were regarded this warning as an improper intimidation and an effort to excuse accelerating police violence. A group of 20 relatives of Israeli hostages held in the Gaza Strip called on Saturday for Netanyahu's resignation and urged cabinet members as well as other government officials to replace him immediately. And one of the parents of a man who's being held in Gaza addressed Netanyahu, and they said to him, after you abandoned our family members on October 7th, 176 days passed in which you failed to secure a hostage release deal. And because you were constantly torpedoing this deal, it is clear that you are an obstacle preventing it from happening. That's a little bit of a paraphrase. And so the parent said, we are forced today to begin a new phase in our just fight. From this moment on, we will take action to immediately remove you from power. Also, 16 residents were arrested by the Israeli police in the West Bank, Kfar Qassam, and northern Israel on the charges of terrorist incitement targeting the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque. So that was over the last 24 hours. I will just say again, and I think I said this yesterday, there was news that this last Friday, another Friday in Ramadan, passed without incident at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So things have been quiet there. In terms of the hostage ceasefire conversation, there's a discussion about the possibility of a new compromise framework regarding a potential hostage deal with Hamas. The goal would be to keep the negotiations moving forward. Egypt reported that the discussions between Israel and Hamas will resume on Sunday in Cairo. And the U.S. reported that they dropped another 46,000 meal equivalents with another airdrop on Friday. This is actually quite interesting. The U.S. has been sanctioning a small number of radical West Bank settlers, and Israeli banks have been honoring those sanctions. And the U.S. Treasury clarified that Israeli banks are not exposed to those sanctions. In other words, they don't have to comply by them if their transactions are intended to cover basic human needs. It doesn't involve the U.S. financial system. In other words, the U.S. is saying, hey, like, you deal with your people over there. And this is a big deal because the Israeli far-right government was furious when the U.S. imposed these sanctions, so much so that some of the leaders of the Israeli government threatened to take revenge on the Palestinian Authority. So what would that mean? According to the journal The Middle East Eye, a news source, Palestinian banks actually could be cut off from the Israeli banking system starting as early as next week. Israel's finance minister, who's a far-right radical, said that he would cease dealings between the financial institutions of the Israeli banking system and the Palestinian banks, according to Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper. Netanyahu has a few days to convene the cabinet to discuss reversing the plans of the finance minister, that's Minister Smotrich, because the plan would isolate Palestinian banks from both the Israeli banks and the international banking systems. Now, just remember, Palestinians don't have their own currency. They use the Israeli shekel, and so they're totally reliant on the Israeli economy. So if this happened, it would just be devastating. Earlier this month, Smotrich had threatened to paralyze the PA's economy in response to the U.S. sanctions that were placed on these 4 West Bank extremist settlers who were accused of violence against Palestinians. So Israeli banks have heeded the sanctions, even though Smotrich told them not to comply. The U.S. told the banks they don't need to comply. So the U.S. is siding with Smotrich, if you're confused about everything I just described, which again is just another example of the U.S. Publicly saying one thing, and then they're saying that they are imposing sanctions on these settlers, but then they're contradicting themselves when they're talking to the Israeli banks. In Syria, this is also quite significant. Things have really been escalating. There were Israeli airstrikes in Syria. I think I talked about this. 52 people have now been reported killed, including 38 members of Syrian government forces. Some of those reported killed were Hezbollah fighters, and other were believed to be Iranian allied militia. So those airstrikes were condemned by Russia. Russia said that they are fraught with extremely dangerous consequences. And finally, 10 contestants in this year's Eurovision Song Contest released a statement calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and saying they wanted to communicate their heartfelt wish for peace and the safe return of all hostages. So many blessings to you and yours as we go into Easter Sunday tomorrow. May the Lord go before us as we seek to celebrate his resurrection.